Hey guys, all right, so today we get to start a new chapter, and in this chapter we're going to be discussing mental health and mental illness. So today all I want to do is just kind of introduce the basic idea, the concept, and we're going to do that by talking a little bit about what it means to be abnormal. So label your notes. Mental health and mental illness, or what was the title of the chapter? Psychological disorders, which means we're going to be talking about mental health and mental illness. We're going to start out by talking about abnormal behavior. The first bullet point here is important because it's an interesting piece of this question, answering whether or not a behavior is abnormal. It's not that easy. And part of the reason it's so difficult to answer that question sometimes and determine whether or not a behavior is normal or abnormal is because some behaviors can be considered abnormal by one person, but completely normal to another person. It depends on perspective. It probably depends on culture. It probably depends on time and place. It probably depends on a lot of different things. So it's very difficult sometimes to determine whether or not a behavior that somebody is exhibiting is normal or abnormal, and therefore sometimes it's very difficult to determine whether or not a certain behavior is indicative of a problem. In this case, maybe a mental health problem or some kind of psychological disorder. So let's just take that idea for a second and think about it. Can you think of any behaviors that one person might think is a normal behavior, but somebody else might consider to be abnormal? Think about that. How about my behavior? Is it normal to get so fired up and so jacked up about talking about psychology? Come on, that can't be normal, right? I see it looks in your eyes whenever I'm up in front of you. You're staring at me like, oh my God, this guy is, there's something wrong with this guy. This dude is not normal, right? Well, if you ask other social studies teachers, other psychology teachers, other psychologists, other teachers in general, they say, oh no, of course you get excited about something like that, right? So there's just one kind of being a little bit humorous, but just so you get the idea. How about this one? How many of you have tattoos? I do not have a tattoo. My wife and I, we're trying to be the last two people on the planet that don't have tattoos. It's becoming, it's viewed a lot differently now than it was a long time ago, right? So what is it? Are you normal because you have a tattoo? Or is that completely abnormal? I'll tell you what it is. That's completely abnormal. Who would do that to their body? It hurts. It's painful. They end up being ugly when you get older. It's dangerous. Why in the world would you ever get a tattoo? That can't be normal. But those of you that are sitting there with tattoos, I would guess are thinking, no way, it's completely normal. All my friends got tattoos. In fact, as I jokingly said, Mrs. Wyman, I want to be the last two people on the earth that don't have tattoos, right? Because it's becoming more and more normal in our culture and our society, even for young people your age, to have tattoos. But ask your grandparents. Do they think it's cool that you have tattoos? All right, maybe ask your great-grandparents, all right? So you get the idea. It is sometimes a matter of perspective, it's a matter of culture, it's a matter of time and place, it's a matter of individual preferences and things like that. So it's not always cut and dry, black and white. This behavior is weird and not normal, and this is how you're supposed to act because this is not weird and this is very normal. So the problem becomes, that's easy for you and I to navigate through because we have our own opinions about certain behaviors. The problem gets a little bit more significant when you start talking about psychologists and psychiatrists, people working in the medical field trying to answer this question about patients and whether or not the behaviors that they're exhibiting and the things that they're experiencing are abnormal enough to diagnose mental health disorders, to treat certain things, to prescribe medicines, to do therapy, whatever. All right? It's a very difficult task sometimes to make that distinction between normal and abnormal. So, how in the world do they do it? Well, we're going to go through 3 different methods that psychology uses to try to answer the question whether or not a behavior is normal or abnormal. So one method that you might like and you might seem logical to you is something they call the deviation method. With the deviation method, it's pretty simple. If somebody is acting different from or deviating from the average or the norm. That's abnormal. If most people don't do this particular behavior, and you do this behavior, and you are deviating from the norms of your culture, your society, your community, well then that's probably abnormal. Everybody else is acting normal. The people that deviate from that must be the abnormal ones. There's some logic to that. Now there's also some limitations to that, especially when you start looking at that deviation method and using that method across cultures, because different behaviors are quite different in terms of norms of behaviors from one culture to the next. And so now, with the world we live in, when people move and relocate and migrate between cultural locations, that can you can have some limitations there. The other big limitation is this. If we solely use this method to determine whether or not the way somebody acts is normal or abnormal, you're going to run into some problems when you start recognizing that sometimes the majority of the people are not right. Sometimes the majority of the people do behaviors that are wrong, that are amoral, for example. So if the majority, for example, of General McLean seniors, if we collected data and we found out that 58% of General McLean seniors are getting drunk or stoned or high once a week, every weekend, 58% of our seniors are drinking alcohol or using drugs. Well, that would mean, based on this theory, that those 58% of our senior students are the normal ones and what they're doing is normal. That would also then mean that those other, what are we left at, 42% of our high school seniors that don't use illegal drugs and don't drink alcohol illegally, they're the ones that are acting abnormal. Well, you're running into some gray areas here at this point because you're talking about illegal behavior versus legal behavior, safe behavior versus unsafe behavior. So, for example, well, let's just leave it at that because we have other theories that we can go through. Hopefully that makes sense and those examples were sufficient. All right, so maybe you don't like that method to determine whether or not a behavior is normal or abnormal. Maybe that limitation is too much for you. All right, well, we have another method that we can use. Another way to try to decide whether or not a behavior is normal or abnormal is through what we would call the adjustment theory or the adjustment method. This one, again, pretty straightforward. The adjustment theory says that if you cannot function physically, emotionally, or socially in your society, then that probably means that there is something abnormal going on. The inability to function physically, emotionally, or socially in society is considered to be abnormal. The people who can get through the day physically, emotionally, and socially, even if they have struggles on a daily basis, but if you can get through it and function and have your relationships, go to school, do your job, do your chores, and get through the day successfully, well then you're probably pretty normal. If you have struggles doing that, maybe there's something going on that's abnormal. So let's try to give you an example that you can relate to. For example, how many of you get nervous the day before you have a big test in some hard class? Psychology. These are easy tests, right? Like calculus or something like that. The night before a test, you're studying, you might get butterflies in your stomach, you're stressing out, you're worried, you can't sleep. But when the morning comes, you get up. As much as you don't feel prepared to get to school and take that calc test, you get on the bus. And as much as you know you're going to fail it, you show up to class and you take the test. And then you get whatever grade you get. Maybe you fail it, maybe you pass it. And then you go through the rest of your day. Well, all of those behaviors are probably pretty normal. Being nervous, sweating while you're taking the test, having a stomach ache. You may have even in the morning said to mom or dad or grandma or grandpa, like, oh, I don't feel good, I don't want to go to school, but they made you go. You just didn't want to take the test, right? That's probably all very normal. Now, the difference is that student who gets so anxious and so stressed out and so worried about a big test that they don't just get a little butterfly in their stomach, they're vomiting at home at night, the night before the test. They actually start to have other symptoms of feeling sick. They physically cannot get out of bed without crying in terror about taking this test and failing it. In which case, mom or dad or grandma or grandpa realize, I can't put this kid on a bus. They're falling apart here over this situation. Well, that pretty much gets to a point where that kid's not functioning properly. You should be able to get out of bed, get on a bus, go to school, and just deal with the circumstances of failing or passing a test that you may not be prepared for. If you can't do that, then there might be something more going on than just simple nervousness about a test, and maybe that's something abnormal. All right, so you got the deviation theory. If you don't like that, maybe look at it in terms of the adjustment theory. Can you adjust and function to get through your day? And if you don't like that, then there's a third option. And this is referred to as the psychological health theory. To be normal, one must fully accept and express his or her own individuality and humanness. This should sound familiar to you guys because this one is rooted in the concepts, the humanistic concepts of self-actualization. A healthy, normal person is one who is striving to reach their self-actualization of their full potential. If you are not trying your best and trying to reach your full potential, then based on this method, this theory, then that's not normal. Because a normal, healthy human is always trying to do that. Now, there are some limitations to this as well. First of all, everybody's potential is different. So one person can be striving really hard to reach their full potential and somebody else might not be, and it's hard to tell the difference. For example, hopefully this is something relatable, let's just say that Joey is in my psych class and so is Susie. And Joey is super smart. No, let's just stop there. Let's do this. Joey is getting a C in my class. It's a high C, it's almost a B. Susie is failing my class. All right, now based on this model here, who is striving to reach their full potential? Who is actually acting more normal in terms of their behavior in my psychology class? Susie, who's failing, or Joey, who's got a nice solid C, almost a B? Well, if that's all you look at, well, I guess Joey must be working harder and doing more work and doing better, right? So he's probably striving to reach his potential. Susie clearly is not because she's failing. Until you start digging a little bit deeper and then you find out Joey is like super brilliant. He has a high IQ. He's a gifted kid. Super lazy. He doesn't do anything. He doesn't have to because he can sit in class and listen to the lecture. He doesn't have to write the notes down and study them later. If it goes in his ears, he remembers it. He got it. He aces all the tests because he remembers every single thing we do and say in class, and he can do that on a test. But he doesn't do any of the work, doesn't do any of the homework, doesn't turn in any of the assignments, and that's where his grade comes down because he gets zeros for those things, right? But he's so smart, he does the calculation all the time, and he does the math, and he's like, I don't need to do that assignment because if I do well on the test, I'm going to get a B no matter what. I figured it out. Susie, on the other hand, failing, she is busting her butt. She has a learning disability maybe. Maybe there's something that makes it more difficult for her to hear things and process them, right? So what she does is she makes flashcards for all the vocabulary. She has mom or dad at home quizzing her a couple nights a week. The nights before the test, she sits down with her big sister, and her big sister goes through and helps her study for 3 hours, and the best she can get is a 68 or 71, and so she's on that cusp of failing psychology. Which one of those two in that example, though, is more normal based on this model? Clearly, Susie is more normal. Susie is healthier. Susie is striving to do her best, and her best might just be a 68 or a 70. Joey is abnormal based on this model because he's not doing his best. He should be able to have 100, probably like 103 because of the extra credit opportunities. So there you go. So there are some limitations to each of these, and there's nothing black and white and cut and dry. So back to where I started with this, it's very difficult for doctors in particular when they're working with mental health patients to be able to diagnose, to be able to determine certain things about behaviors and what they mean. Which leads us to, all right, if it's still so difficult, how in the world are they able to do it? Because we do have doctors who can get to the bottom of things. Not always. Mental health is a very tricky situation, but there are ways that psychiatrists and psychologists can diagnose, classify, figure out, determine what a behavior really is. The method is the DSM-5. There actually might be the DSM-6 now. I got to look into that. It used to be the DSM-4, now it's the DSM-5, and it is just that Roman numeral is just for what version of it is. And the more we study and the more we learn about psychological health problems, the more we put into this DSM. So the DSM stands for Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Basically what it is a giant book that outlines every single mental health symptom, problem, condition, disorder we've ever discovered and figured out. And it's massive. And it covers all the symptoms of all of the mental health disorders. Now, there's some discussion of it in your text, and you can look there. Now, the thing about that is it's a tricky tool to use, and you really need to be an expert, a psychiatrist, a psychologist, a doctor to use it appropriately, because I've looked at it before, but if I were to give you a copy of the DSM and you started looking through it, wouldn't take you very long for you to say, holy cow, I have this disorder. Then you look through a couple more, oh my goodness, I have this disorder too. And then you look through a couple more, oh my goodness, my boyfriend, my girlfriend, my mom, my dad has this disorder or that one. Because it has every single thing that has ever been diagnosed or identified as being abnormal or a symptom or anything like that. A lot of our typical normal everyday human behaviors show up in this book. The experts know how to use the book, and they know when certain symptoms or certain behaviors or certain tendencies are just normal human tendencies or behaviors, and when they're not, and when they start to cross-reference different things and they start putting all the pieces together using that manual, then they can start diagnosing disorders. So if you do, check it out and look it up and start looking through it. Be careful, all right? Don't go diagnosing yourself or anybody else with mental health disorders. Okay, so there's just a little bit about the idea of what makes behavior normal or abnormal and how difficult it is to really answer that question. All right, now we are not going to be diving into the DSM-4. We are not psychologists. I am not a psychologist. We've talked about this many, many times. So what is it that we want to look at as we study this chapter for a brief time? What do you need to know? Well, there are a couple things that I've prioritized. And these are the things that we're going to try to focus on here, okay? All right, so let me go through this slide. First of all, one of the things I want you to understand, and one of the things that we'll elaborate a little bit as we get into this unit, is that the general public, probably yourself included, and even me, lacks knowledge about mental illness. It's a historical thing, it's a cultural thing, it's a human thing probably, but generally speaking, most people have limited knowledge about mental illness, and the knowledge that they do have is oftentimes misconstrued and inaccurate, okay? It's based on the way mental illness is portrayed in film and media. It's the limited experience or exposure that maybe a lot of people have to mental illness. Oftentimes people want to look at mental illness in terms of absolutes. Like if you do that, there's something wrong with you. You're crazy, or you're insane, or you're mentally ill. Back to some of the examples I just shared earlier. It's not that simple. It's not that cut and dry. It's not that black and white. Now the problem with that is this lack of knowledge has created an environment that is very stigmatizing. We're going to be talking about stigma a little bit more. Hopefully you understand what I mean by stigma. But it's, when a lot of people have this negative conception of mental illness, so that if someone does have a mental illness, or somebody does shows symptoms, or somebody does take a certain pill or sees a certain doctor, there's a stigma that goes with that, and they're looked upon negatively oftentimes in our society. So this stigma has created a lot of issues and a lot of problems in terms of mental health in our society. The stigma has led to people with mental illness being mistreated by friends and family, by being mistreated by strangers just in the public eye, but it goes deeper than that, being mistreated by law enforcement, being mistreated by the court system, so on and so forth. That's at the extreme level, but it also has created a situation where people with mental illness have this sense of shame or embarrassment. Now, I've told you quite a bit about my brother who suffers from some pretty severe mental health conditions that he deals with on a daily basis, and he has shame, and he is embarrassed, which is awful. It's terrible. It's nothing he could do about it. It's the same as if you fell out of a tree and you broke your arm. I mean, what are you going to do? That happens, right? You just got to work with it, try to get it fixed. Shouldn't be ashamed of it or embarrassed. Well, mental illness has really, hopefully we're moving in a different direction, but historically we have seen this shame, this embarrassment, this stigma. It has also created a situation where supports out there are limited. Oftentimes families even want to distance themselves from family members who end up with mental health disorders, and so that family support sometimes is even lacking. But the support in things like the medical insurance business, supports in terms of government aid and agencies for Medicare and Medicaid and medical insurance, that kind of stuff, mental illness doesn't find itself always in the same situation as other illnesses. And unfortunately, because of all these things, there is this terrible situation where people with mental illness oftentimes either can't get treatment, aren't insured to get treatment, or simply don't reach out to try to get treatment because of the shame and the embarrassment. 56%, these are numbers that are sort of speculative, but also based in research. 56% of mental illnesses and people with mental illness refuse to get treatment or can't get treatment. So we're talking there are more people that are suffering from mental illness that are getting no treatment than there are people suffering from mental illness that are actually getting treated for, and that's something that has to change. A couple other things that I want you to understand, especially after we got done talking about all this normal stuff, is that even if you can determine that somebody is abnormal or that a behavior is abnormal, that does not equate to being mentally ill. Being weird and goofy and kooky and just acting different and strange, in many cases, there's nothing wrong with that. It doesn't mean you're sick. I love some of the weird, kooky kids that come through here and some of the strange personalities that I meet out there. It's part of what makes life awesome, right? So just to be abnormal doesn't mean that you're sick or mentally ill and there's something wrong with you. It's also important to understand that all people that are mentally ill are not necessarily abnormal, weird, kooky, or strange. There are people that are in your classrooms, that are in your place of work, that you pass on the streets. There are people in your family that are completely normal and are suffering from mental illness. So it's very important that you understand that basic principle. My brother Hank, he is a little goofy, a little bit quirky, a little bit odd at times, and part of that is because of some of the things that he deals with as mental health, but that doesn't mean he's abnormal. He's just a normal dude that people love hanging out with, right? So not everybody who is mentally ill is in fact abnormal. It's also very important that you understand, and maybe you have already experienced this, that mild psychological health problems, mild mental health disorders are extremely common. I've dealt with them over the years of my life. Most people somewhere along the line are going to suffer from at least some mild symptoms of mental health problems. And it's just part of the human experience. We talked about stress and health and that eustress and trying to harness the positivity that comes with stress in our lives. Well, guess what? What was the Celia quote? The only time we're going to escape stress is whenever we're dead, because it's part of being alive and part of being a human. And so mild psychological health problems are extremely common. Think about it this way. You think of it in terms of what we call adjustments. Adjustments are things that happen that we have to adjust to. Those are periods of life or experiences in our lives where something changes and we have to make these adjustments. For example, how many of you have ever lost a pet? That's an adjustment. How many of you ever lost a loved one? That's an adjustment. How many of you have ever moved to a different neighborhood, a different school, a different town? Those are adjustments. How many of you went from 8th grade to 9th grade and had to go to different buildings? That's an adjustment. Well, when we have these experiences, oftentimes they come with mild psychological health problems. For example, dealing with the death of a pet or the death of a loved one, you may suffer from some slight symptoms of depression. That's completely normal. It does not mean that you need to go to a doctor. It doesn't mean that you need to be diagnosed with clinical depression. It doesn't mean that you need to take a pill or anything like that. It just means that you need to work through, adjust, cope, and then get yourself back to normal, if we want to use the terms abnormal and normal, right? So these are all things that I think are very important for you as young students learning about mental health should know. And these are kind of the things that we'll focus on over the course of this chapter, and we'll elaborate on some of these as we go through it. All right, there's your introduction, and hopefully we have a good time with this new chapter.